Where Faith Reigns. Today's daily devotion from Pastor Greg Laurie.
Our scripture reading today is from Matthew chapter 14, verse 30. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted.
Peter had his eyes on Jesus. He had faith. He was doing the impossible. But then he started to sink. He took his eyes off Jesus, and he sank because he was afraid. Faith gives way to fear, and trust gives way to worry. In Peter's case, he looked at the wind. In our case, it might be something else. But we forget God, and then we start to sink. Where faith reigns, fear has no place. Where fear reigns, faith is driven away. Faith and fear don't like each other. Do you know certain people who don't get along? Maybe you're planning a family reunion, and you can't invite certain relatives because if they're in the same room, they'll have an argument. They just don't mix. The same is true of faith and fear. When you bring in faith, fear will walk out the back door. And when you invite fear inside, you will drive faith away. Maybe that's happening to you today. So what should you do? You should do what Peter did. When you're sinking, call out to Jesus. Matthew 14:30 tells us, "But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. 'Save me, Lord,' he shouted." Notice this says that Peter began to sink. He didn't wait until he was 4 feet under to call out to Jesus. Sometimes we might be embarrassed to admit to God that we need help, but there's no shame in that. That's what we ought to do. Do you think Peter's failure came as a surprise to Jesus? Hardly. The Lord knew all about Peter. He had his number. And he knew this about Peter the day he called him and gave him his new name, which meant rock. Jesus knew what Peter would become. He didn't just see him for what he was, he saw him for what he would be. And that's how God sees us. We see our shortcomings, we see our flaws, but God looks at us and says, "I see what you are going to be. I see a finished piece of art. You just see a blank canvas. I see a refined diamond. You see a lump of coal. I see what you will be." Jesus knew that Peter would fail, not only on this occasion, but later when Peter would deny him. Peter's failure came as no shock to Jesus, and neither does yours. Jesus immediately reached down and lifted Peter up. Then he said, "You have so little faith. Why did you doubt me?" We can almost hear a tenderness in Jesus' voice. Maybe you're sinking right now. You're filled with fear, worry, and defeat, and you're wondering what you should do. Follow the example of Peter and simply say, "Lord, save me." He will not rebuke the person who is trying to come to him by faith. Cry out to Jesus, and then watch what he will do for you.